Hi everyone, today I'm going to show you how to add validation to your text input. So I'm going to create a separate component for that. I'm going to put it in this file validation text input.js. I'm just putting it in a separate file so it's separated out and it'll just keep things nice and tidy and you can just reuse it wherever you want inside your applications. And so yeah, start off just defining my functional component here. I'm not going to return anything yet as I'm just going to go ahead and reference that from within my app.js. So I'm going to use this validation text input and that's going to automatically import. It's got a couple of properties that I'm going to want to define. So I'm going to want, for example, a placeholder. This is actually something that you can specify on a normal text input and I'm just going to specify mine as email. I might want a regex expression that's or pattern. That's basically what I want to test my input against to see if it's a valid input, and then I'm going to just have a validation message that I'm going to display to the user so that they can go ahead and fix their input. So mine's just going to be please enter a valid email in this case. I'm going to create a second one of these just so you can sort of see that I can add multiple ones and reuse that component there. So once again, I'm going to add a placeholder. And anything that I would provide to a normal text input, I want to be able to provide to this validation text input. So for example, if I wanted to be able to control the type of the keyboard to be numbers, I would be able to enter the type of the keyboard and that should pass through to the text input. I'm going to show you how to do that using the spread operator. You may also notice that my code is reformatting itself when I save sometimes. I'm using the prettier JavaScript extension to help me there. Just makes things sort of consistent in how they're um, laid out. Means you don't need to think about that sort of thing as much. So I'm going to import a couple of components from React Native, the first being text input because that's what I'm creating. I'm also going to need a style sheet as I'm going to style my text input. I want a view because I'm going to have text, which is going to be my validation message, and also my text input. Also, I'm just going to import useState. The reason I need useState is because I'm going to need that to keep track of the text value inside the text input so the text input can update accordingly. So I'm setting up my state variable for text. I'm just going to call it text and I'm going to have a setter function called setText. Basically, when setText is called, we're going to get a re-render because the state variable text will change. And I'm also going to have a state variable for validation, and that's going to control whether a validation message is showed on screen or not. I'm just going to initialize those to a default value of undefined, and I'm going to take the props from that functional component there. The props are going to allow me to specify my placeholder against the text input and stuff like that. And I'll also be able to get my regular expression pattern from there for testing my validations. Now I'm going to go and create some styles. So the first one I'm going to want to create is just a simple container style. It's just going to be how I lay out things within my main view. I'm choosing a line cell stretch as I want to make the text input take up the entire width, which means I need the parent to be wide also. I'm also just going to add a horizontal and vertical margin so that my text inputs aren't too cluttered. They'll just make them sort of easier to click on. Then I need to go ahead and add that view inside my return, and that's what's going to render on screen. So you can see I saved now, it's got nothing there. That's because I've got nothing inside my view. I'm going to go ahead and add a text component now with that validation message. So I can test that validation message is working just by setting a value as the default, and you can see test shows up twice if I have two validation text input components in my app.js. I'm just going to want to add some small amount of styling to that message just so it shows as more of an error. Errors are typically red, so I'm just going to make it red. And I'll just apply that style to the text. Cool, that looks a lot better. So now I can go back to having no validation message as there is none at this stage. Next up, I'm adding my text input, so I'm going to want to add a few properties for that. So the value is going to come from that state variable for text. I'm using the spread operator here with props, which basically means anything that's passed to that validation text input as a prop will be passed on to that text input also. So you can see those placeholders are now showing up that I passed through. Regex would be against it too, and validation message, but those aren't actually props on the text input, so they do nothing there. So yeah, you can see I've got email and phone there. So it doesn't look like the nicest text input, so I'm just going to add a little bit of simple styling. I'm just going to add a border so it's really easy to see the text input itself. I'm going to align south to be stretch. That's basically going to make it take up the whole width of the device and make it just a little bit less erratic in its behavior when it's resizing due to text changing. I'm going to apply that style to the text input. When I save, you can see that I've got this nice text input that's outlined and very obvious where it takes up space. And I can add a validation message and it will just show above that. You can see there's not a lot of spacing between the message and the text input, so I'm just going to add a little margin to that text validation message just so it looks a little bit better. And I'm happy with that result. So now comes the validation. So basically, I'm going to want to validate the input is valid, and that's going to be based on the regex pattern that's been passed in. So I'm going to just specify a constant that is valid. I'm going to use that regex, and I'm going to use the test function on it, and I'm going to pass in the input, which is basically the text input that I need to test is valid. If it's not valid, then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to set that validation message to be the one passed in by the props. So I'll go props.validation message. And if it is valid, then I'm going to want to clear that validation message. So I'll call set validation message and pass nothing in. That will update the screen accordingly when I validate my inputs. Now, in order for your text to actually update, you need this on change text handler. And what I'm going to do when the text changes is call that set text function. So you may ask why I didn't call validate directly here. Testing regex can actually take some time depending on the complexity of your pattern. So you might not want to do it all the time, that's up to you, but you need to be mindful about holding up the UI if you're doing it quite regularly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do it when it ends editing, so it just happens infrequently and doesn't block the UI. So I'm calling validate with the text when the end editing happens. And that's kind of happens when you probably hit return or exit out of a text input. So you can see when I exit out of that text input, it gave me that validation message, and you can see the validation message against both. Now if I enter a valid phone number like this, you can see the validation message doesn't go away until I click out, because that's when it validates. We may want to be a bit more responsive than that. So what we might want to do is, if there is a validation message, we might want to check more regularly so that we can, because we imagine that the user is probably going to be drawing their attention to that, and so they might be making changes to help improve that, and we want to give them faster feedback on when they've actually got it correct. So we're creating a new function called handle text change. That's going to set our text when the text changes, and it's also going to check if there's a validation message. If there is a validation message, it's going to perform validation. So I'll just call that validate function with my input. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you that. So if I go ahead and make it have an error, so I'm just going to make the validation apply by ending editing, and then fix it up. Well, it should make that error message go away. So there must be an error in my code somewhere. Just realized I forgot to update this on change text to be handle text change. So now it will perform the validation if there is a validation message as well. So there's no validation message now, but if I click out and make it invalid, then you can see a validation message. If I correct it because there was a validation message, it performed the validation. Now that there was no validation message, then it doesn't perform the validation when you perform any text changes. So it's limiting the amount of time it validates to just be probably when the user's wanting input on it. Showing you the email at the moment. You can see it goes away once I enter a valid email. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today. If you have, please like and subscribe for more content. All my code is available on GitHub.